The boss's son stood in the doorway of the machine shed and laughed until he had to wipe his eyes, laughed at the sweating black man kneeling in the dirt, welding the same tractor bracket for the third time that month. "Third time, Isaiah," he called out over the hiss of the torch. "You know, for a man who claims he used to be some kind of big-shot engineer, you sure can't keep a weld from cracking. Maybe engineering's a little over your head, huh? Stick to what you're good at." And the men lounging by the fuel drums laughed with him, because you always laugh when the boss's son laughs. What Cody Harmon did not know, what none of them knew, was that the bracket was not cracking because of Isaiah's welds. The bracket was cracking because of a defect buried in the steel itself, a flaw that Isaiah had already traced, measured and documented across 9 machines, a flaw that had nearly killed a man on that very farm, and a flaw that connected to a secret in Isaiah Bell's past that was about to turn a laughing man's whole world upside down. Stay with me all the way to the end, because you are about to watch the man everyone mocked as just the welder bring an entire manufacturer to its knees with a notebook, a broken bracket, and the truth. And if a story about a quiet man who was underestimated one time too many is what you came for, hit subscribe and ring that bell right now, because these get buried and you're the reason they get seen. His name was Isaiah Bell, and he was 52 years old, and he had a master's degree in mechanical engineering that nobody within 40 miles of the Harmon farm knew about. He never mentioned it, and there was a reason he never mentioned it, and the reason was a wound so deep he had learned to walk around it the way you learn to walk around a bad knee, but we'll get to that. First, you have to see him the way the men at the Harmon farm saw him, because the whole story is about the gap between what they saw and what was true. What they saw was a welder, a hired hand, a big, quiet, careful black man in his 50s who showed up before anyone else and left after everyone else, who could fix anything with an engine or a frame or a hydraulic line, who never complained, never raised his voice, and never ever gave any of them the satisfaction of a reaction when they needled him. They saw a man who took whatever the day handed him and did the work and went home to a small rented house at the edge of the county, and as far as any of them knew or cared, did nothing else worth knowing about. The Harmon farm was not really a farm anymore, not the way Isaiah's grandfather would have understood the word. It was an agricultural operation, 2,000 acres of row crops and a fleet of heavy equipment, worth more than every house in the nearest town combined, run by old Walt Harmon, who was 78 and slowing down, and increasingly by Walt's son Cody, who was 34, and had never in his life done a hard day's work that he could pay someone else to do. Cody Harmon is the laughing man in this story, and I want to be fair to him because the world makes a lot of Cody Harmons, and it is not entirely their fault. He had been handed everything. I had grown up on a place that ran like a machine because men like Isaiah made it run, and he had drawn from that the lesson that the world simply worked, that equipment ran and crops grew and money appeared, and that the men who actually made those things happen were interchangeable and beneath him, and mostly a cost to be complained about. He mistook having been born on third base for having built the stadium. And because Isaiah was the most skilled man on the place, and the quietest, and the one least likely to fight back, Cody had made him a special target, the way weak men always find the strong, silent one and mistake his silence for a safe place to be cruel. The thing they were fighting about, though none of them knew it was a fight yet, was the tractors. The Harmon operation had 2 years earlier bought a fleet of new tractors, a big capital purchase, 9 machines of the same model, a heavy modern workhorse from a major manufacturer I'll call Continental Ag, one of the giants of the industry. They were beautiful machines, expensive, and they were supposed to last 20 years. They were breaking. Specifically, a structural bracket, a heavy steel component that connected the front axle assembly to the frame, kept developing cracks. It started about 8 months after the fleet came in. One machine, then another, then another. The cracks were dangerous. A bracket like that failing under load at speed could drop a front axle and roll a machine, and a rolled tractor kills the person on it more often than not. And in fact, 6 weeks before the day, Cody stood laughing in the shed doorway. One of the brackets had failed on a machine being operated by a young hand named Marcus Webb, and the front end had dropped and the tractor had lurched and very nearly gone over on a slope, and Marcus had jumped clear and broken his wrist and been, everyone agreed, extraordinarily lucky to be alive. Continental Ag's response to all of this had been consistent and infuriating. Their dealer sent technicians who inspected the failures and issued the same verdict every time: operator error and improper maintenance. The customer, they said, was overloading the machines or running them wrong or failing to service them, and the bracket failures were the customer's own fault. Each repair was billed at a premium. The warranty claims were denied. And when the near-fatal failure with Marcus Webb happened, Continental's regional rep had come out personally, expressed his sympathy, and then explained smoothly that the incident was clearly the result of the machine being operated on too steep a grade against the guidelines, and that Continental bore no responsibility, and that if the Harmons wished to keep their fleet running, they would need to keep paying for repairs and perhaps consider whether their operators were adequately trained. Cody had accepted this. Of course he had. Cody could not imagine that a company as big as Continental Ag could be wrong, and it was easier, and it flattered his contempt for the men who ran his equipment to believe that the problem was operator error, which is to say the problem was people like Isaiah and Marcus. So every time a bracket cracked, Cody had Isaiah welded, and every time a weld eventually failed again, Cody laughed at Isaiah for being unable to keep a weld from cracking, and the whole rotten cycle turned, and it never once occurred to Cody Harmon that the man he was laughing at had months ago quietly figured out the truth. Because Isaiah Bell was not just welding those brackets. Isaiah Bell was studying them. You have to understand what Isaiah was under the coveralls to understand what he had been doing. 20 years earlier, Isaiah Bell had been a design engineer. Not a hobbyist, not a shade tree mechanic, a credentialed working mechanical engineer with a master's degree and a specialty in structural fatigue and materials failure. The exact science of why and how metal parts crack under repeated loads. And he had not worked at just any company. He had worked for 11 years at Continental Ag. That was the wound. Isaiah had been good, better than good at Continental. I had worked on structural design on exactly the kind of load-bearing components that were now cracking on the Harmon farm. And 2 decades ago, he had been the only black engineer in his division, and he had watched year after year as men he had trained were promoted past him as his ideas showed up in other men's presentations, as the path that should have been his was quietly closed. When a round of restructuring came, Isaiah's position was eliminated and the work he did was distributed to younger, cheaper, whiter engineers, and he was walked out with a severance and a handshake and a form to sign and something in him. Some belief about whether the world would ever let him be what he was broke and did not fully heal. There was a specific day the break happened, and Isaiah could have told you the date 20 years later without pausing. I had spent 8 months on a redesign of a load-bearing component, solving a fatigue problem that had stumped the division, and he had solved it elegantly, completely, and he had presented it to his manager, and his manager had nodded and thanked him and told him it was good work. 3 months later, that solution appeared in a major design review presented by a younger engineer named Doug with Isaiah's name nowhere on it. And when Isaiah went to his manager about it quietly, the way he did everything, his manager had looked uncomfortable and said the words that Isaiah carried like a stone for the rest of his life. Isaiah, you're a great engineer, but you're not really leadership material. You don't have the presence, and Doug does. This is how it works. Take the win where you can get it and don't make it a thing. Don't make it a thing. I had done the work, and a man with the right face had done the presenting, and Isaiah was told that noticing this out loud would make him difficult. 6 months later, his position was eliminated in restructuring, and Doug was promoted, and Isaiah was walked out with a folder and a handshake. He had spent a few years trying to catch on elsewhere and hit the same walls, the interviews that went cold, the roles that went to men who reminded the hiring managers of themselves, and eventually he had stopped trying to be an engineer in a world that kept telling him he was not allowed to be one. And he had fallen back on the thing no one could take from him, which was that he was extraordinary with his hands, and he had become to the world's eye a welder. He moved to a quiet county. He took work where he found it. I told no one what he had been, partly out of pride and partly out of the specific exhaustion of a man tired of watching his own credentials produce nothing but other people's discomfort. And then on a farm in the middle of nowhere, 20 years later, a fleet of Continental Ag tractors started cracking exactly the kind of component he had spent his career designing, and the universe, which has a sense of humor, put the one man in the county who could diagnose the failure directly under the boss's son's mocking finger. Isaiah had known within the first 2 failures that it was not operator error, because Isaiah could read a fracture surface the way a doctor reads an X-ray. A crack from overloading looks one way. A crack from a defect in the material or the design looks another, and the brackets on the Harmon fleet were failing in a pattern that screamed to a trained eye of a fundamental flaw. The cracks originated at the same point on every machine, a stress concentration at a poorly designed transition in the bracket's geometry, and the fracture surfaces showed the fine, brittle character of steel that had not been properly heat-treated, steel that was too hard and therefore too brittle. Cracking under normal loads it should have handled for decades. So Isaiah, quietly off the clock on his own, had started documenting. He was, after all, still an engineer, whatever the world called him. He kept a notebook. Every failure he recorded: the machine, the hours, the load history. He could reconstruct the exact location and character of the crack. He photographed every fracture surface. He kept the broken brackets, all of them, that Cody thought he was throwing away, stacked in the back of his own truck and then in his own garage at home. He measured the bracket geometry and calculated the stress concentration and confirmed with the math he had not done professionally in 20 years, but had never forgotten that the design placed the peak stress exactly where every crack was starting. And using a portable hardness tester he bought with his own money, he tested the steel of the failed brackets and found it consistently harder, brittle than the specification for that grade should allow evidence of a manufacturing process gone wrong, a whole production run of improperly treated steel, 9 machines, 9 data points, a pattern as clear as a signature. Isaiah Bell had assembled on his own time in the evenings, unpaid and unasked, a professional-grade engineering failure analysis, proving that Continental Ag had shipped a fleet of tractors with a fatal design and manufacturing defect, and was now blaming its customers and its customers' workers for the deaths and injuries that defect was going to keep causing. He had not shown it to anyone, and here we arrive at the real question of the story, the human one, the one that has nothing to do with metallurgy. Why not? Why would a man sit on proof like that? Because Isaiah Bell was tired, and Isaiah Bell was afraid, and Isaiah Bell had learned a lesson 20 years ago that the world had taught him with great thoroughness, that when a black man tells a powerful institution it is wrong, the institution does not thank him. It destroys him. He had told the truth once in his own quiet way about being passed over, about the ideas that went missing, and the truth had cost him his career. He had a notebook full of proof that Continental Ag was wrong, and every instinct beaten into him over 52 years told him that the safest thing, the survivable thing, was to keep welding the brackets. Keep his head down, keep the notebook in a drawer, and let it be someone else's fight. There was one more thing pulling at him, and it had a face. After the accident, Isaiah had gone to see Marcus Webb, the young hand who broke his wrist when the bracket failed. He had gone in the evening on his own to the small house where Marcus lived with his young wife and their baby, and he had brought a bag of groceries because he knew from his own hard years exactly how fast a hurt wrist with no work becomes an empty refrigerator. Marcus had been ashamed sitting there with his arm in a cast because Continental's rep had told everyone the accident was his fault, that he'd run the machine wrong, and a young man believes a company in a suit over his own memory, and Marcus had been carrying the belief that he had nearly killed himself through his own stupidity. And Isaiah had sat in that little kitchen and looked at the frightened young father blaming himself for a company's crime. And something had turned over in him that night, though it took Cody's North Slope comment weeks later to finish the job. Because Isaiah knew sitting in that kitchen that the accident was not Marcus's fault, that he had the proof of it in a drawer, and that his silence was letting a good young man carry shame that belonged to Continental Ag. He had almost told Marcus the truth that night. He hadn't. He had said only, "It wasn't your fault, son. Whatever they told you, it wasn't your fault." And Marcus had looked at him with such desperate hope that Isaiah had to leave before he said more than he was ready to back up. That is where he was the morning Cody Harmon stood laughing in the doorway, poised on the edge of the same silence that had swallowed his whole second act. And what tipped him off that edge was not the mockery. Isaiah had absorbed 1,000 mockeries. It was something Cody said next. Because Cody, riding the high of his own comedy, wound down from laughing and said, still grinning, "Nah, but seriously, Isaiah, get it welded good this time, because I'm putting that machine back on the North Slope tomorrow and I'm sticking the new kit on it. Can't have my expensive equipment sitting idle because my welder can't weld." The new kid. Another Marcus Webb. Another young man on the machine with the cracking bracket on the slope because Cody Harmon would rather believe his workers were incompetent than believe his equipment was defective, and would rather risk a life than admit he'd been wrong. And Isaiah Bell knelt there in the dirt with the torch in his hand, and he thought about a young man going over on the north slope tomorrow, and he understood that his silence was no longer just about him. His silence now had a name and a face and a shift assignment. If he kept the notebook in the drawer to protect himself, and that kid died, then Isaiah was not a careful man protecting himself. He was a man who had proof in his pocket and let someone die to keep it there, and that he found he could not do. There are things a man cannot weld a seam over. He turned off the torch. He stood up slowly, his 52-year-old knees complaining, and he set the torch down and he took off his welding gloves, and he looked at Cody Harmon, and he said the first sentence he had ever said to that young man that was not yes or okay or silence. "That machine isn't going on the north slope tomorrow," Isaiah said, "and no kid is getting on it, not until your father and I have a conversation." The shed went quiet. Cody's grin curdled. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Isaiah said. "Where's Walt? I need to see Walt today, and I need you there too, Cody, because you're going to want to hear this, and you're going to wish you'd heard it a long time ago. If you are leaning in right now, if you want to see the boss's son find out what the man he mocked has been, building that feeling is exactly why this channel exists, and the only way we keep making these is your tap on that subscribe button. Do it now, and let's get everybody in the room." They gathered that afternoon in the farm office, old Walt Harmon behind his desk, Cody leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and a smirk that was working hard to stay on his face, and Isaiah Bell standing in the middle of the room, and for the first time in the 20 years since Continental Ag walked him out the door, Isaiah Bell became again in front of witnesses the thing he actually was. He had brought the notebook, he had brought a folder of the photographs, and he had brought carried in from his truck and set on the desk with a heavy thud 3 of the failed brackets, the fracture surfaces facing up. "Mr. Harmon," Isaiah said to Walt, "before I say what I came to say, I have to tell you something about myself, because you're not going to believe the rest of it otherwise, and I don't blame you." He took a breath. "I have a master's degree in mechanical engineering. My specialty was structural fatigue and materials failure, which is the science of why metal parts crack. And for 11 years I worked as a design engineer at Continental Ag, the company that built your tractors. I designed components like the one that's failing on your fleet. I left the industry 20 years ago for reasons that are my own business, and I have not told a soul in this county what I used to be, and I would have kept it that way, except that your son intends to put a young man on a machine with a defective part tomorrow, and I'm not willing to let that happen and stay quiet." Walt Harmon looked at his welder for a long moment. Cody made a sound that was trying to be a laugh and didn't quite make it. "You expect us to believe," Cody started. "I expect you to look at the evidence," Isaiah said not unkindly, and he laid it out. He did it the way he would have done it in a conference room at Continental 20 years ago, clear and methodical and devastating. He showed them the notebook, 9 failures. Everyone cracking at the identical point, a pattern impossible to explain by operator error, because 9 different operators running 9 different machines under different loads do not produce identical failures at the identical location, unless the cause is in the part itself. He showed them the photographs of the fracture surfaces, and he explained in plain language how to read them. How a fatigue crack from overload looks different from a brittle crack in bad steel, and how every single one of these was the second kind. He showed them his stress calculations, proving the bracket's own geometry concentrated force exactly where the cracks began, a design flaw. And he showed them the hardness test results, the same brittle out-of-spec steel in every failed part, a manufacturing flaw, a whole bad production run. "Continental told you it was operator error," Isaiah said. "Continental told you Marcus Webb nearly died because he ran the machine wrong. That is a lie. I can say it's a lie because I used to write the reports that companies like Continental use to say things like that, and I know exactly what an honest failure analysis looks like, and I know exactly what a cover-up looks like, and this is a cover-up. Your machines are defective, every one of the 9. Continental almost certainly knows it because their own engineers can read a fracture surface as well as I can, and they are betting that their customers can't, and that a farmer in this county will never be able to prove it, and that if a man gets killed, they'll settle quietly and blame the operator and keep selling the fleet. And they were right about all of that, Mr. Harmon. Right up until the fleet got sold to the one farm in America that happened to hire a Continental structural engineer as its welder. The office was dead silent. Cody Harmon had stopped smirking a while ago. Old Walt Harmon was leaning forward, staring at the 3 broken brackets on his desk, and something was working behind the old man's eyes, because Walt, whatever his son had become, had built this place himself with his own hands 60 years ago, and knew in his gut the difference between a man making excuses and a man telling the truth, and he was looking at a man telling the truth. "Why didn't you say something before?" Walt asked quietly. "Marcus got hurt 6 weeks ago, Isaiah. You've been welding these things for months. Why now?" And Isaiah Bell told him the truth about that too, because he had decided that day to be done with the silence entirely. "Because the last time I told a big company it was wrong," Isaiah said. "It cost me my whole career, and I have spent 20 years learning to keep my head down so it wouldn't happen again. I was afraid, Mr. Harmon. I had this proof in a drawer for weeks. And I was afraid of what happens to a man like me when he stands up and says a company like Continental is lying. I'm ashamed of that. But then your son told me he was putting a kid on that machine on the North Slope tomorrow, and I realized my silence had stopped being about protecting myself and started being about whether a young man goes home to his family. So now, that's why now." Walt Harmon looked at his son. Cody had gone pale, because Cody was for the first time doing the arithmetic, thinking about all the times he had blamed and mocked and threatened the workers, all the repair bills he had paid to Continental, believing his own men were the problem, the near death of Marcus Webb that he had accepted as operator error because it was easier than a fight, and the kid he had scheduled for the North Slope tomorrow, a decision that had felt like nothing an hour ago, and now felt like a loaded gun he had been about to hand someone. "Dad," Cody said, and his voice had lost all its swagger. "If he's right, he's right," Walt said flatly, still looking at the brackets. "Look at the man, look at the work. He's right, and we've been paying that company to insult us and calling it maintenance." He turned to Isaiah, and the old farmer did something his son had never once done. He stood up, and he came around the desk, and he held out his hand. "Mr. Bell," he said, and the "Mr." landed on Cody like a slap. "I have had you on this place for 2 years, and I let my son call you a welder, and I never once asked what else you might be. That's my failing, and I'm too old to pretend it isn't. What do you need from me to do this right?" What Isaiah needed, it turned out, was permission and backing, and Walt Harmon gave him both. Here is what happened next, and it is the part where the quiet man's 20-year-old wound finally began to heal. Isaiah did not go off half-cocked. He was an engineer. He did it properly. With Walt's backing and Walt's money, they took Isaiah's analysis to an independent testing laboratory, an accredited one, and had the failed brackets professionally examined, and the lab confirmed every single thing Isaiah had found. The design flaw, the out-of-specification steel, the whole bad production run. Isaiah's notebook, his photographs, his calculations, all of it held up completely under professional scrutiny because it had been done by a professional, whatever his coverall said. Then they got a lawyer, a good one, and the lawyer took one look at an independent lab report confirming a fatal defect, a near-fatal injury, and a documented pattern of the manufacturer, blaming customers to dodge liability, and understood that he was holding not a farm's repair dispute, but the seed of something very large. Because if 9 machines on one farm had the defect, and the defect came from a bad production run and a flawed design, then it was not 9 machines. It was every machine of that model that Continental Ag had built and sold, thousands of them on thousands of farms each. One a bracket away from dropping a front axle on a slope with somebody's son on it. The lawyer contacted Continental Ag. And Continental Ag, for the first time, was talking not to a farmer they could dismiss, but to an accredited lab report and a lawyer. And behind them, a failure analysis authored by a man who knew Continental's own engineering from the inside, who could not be baffled or condescended to or told he'd operated the machine wrong, who knew exactly which internal processes had failed and exactly how the company's own engineers would have known. Continental tried at first to do what Continental always did. They disputed, they delayed, they implied the independent lab was mistaken. And then Isaiah's lawyer sent them a document that ended the dispute in a single afternoon, Isaiah's professional analysis on which appeared in the author's credentials, the fact that its author was a former Continental Ag structural engineer with 11 years in their own component design division. The message underneath was unmistakable. This is not a customer you can fool. This is one of your own, and he can read your failures, and he is not on your side anymore because you made sure of that 20 years ago. The defect became impossible to bury. There was a recall, a large one, thousands of machines, the kind of recall that makes the trade press and costs a company an enormous amount of money, and more importantly, that pulls thousands of defective brackets off thousands of farms before they can drop an axle on anyone else's son. Marcus Webb, the young man who broke his wrist and every other operator hurt by the defect across thousands of farms, was made whole in a way Continental had spent months insisting they were not owed, and a written retraction of the operator error finding was issued in his case. A piece of paper, Marcus framed and hung in his own kitchen. And the Harmon Farms fleet was repaired and compensated properly at Continental's expense, because it turned out the customer had not been the problem after all. There is a scene from those weeks that I have to give you, because it is the one that mattered most to Isaiah, more than the recall, more than the money, more than any of it. When the independent lab report came back and confirmed everything, before the lawyers, before the recall, Isaiah drove out to Marcus Webb's little house one evening, the way he had after the accident, and he sat down again at that kitchen table with the young father and his wife, and he laid the lab report on the table, and he told Marcus the truth, all of it, that the bracket was defective, that the company had known or should have known, that the near death on the slope had not been Marcus's fault by even 1%, that no operator alive could have prevented it, that the shame he had been carrying for 6 weeks belonged to a corporation and not to him. And he watched a 24-year-old man read an engineering report he only half understood and get to the part underlined that said, "The failure was not attributable to operator action," and put his face in his one good hand and cry because a weight he had been carrying, a weight that had been quietly telling him he was careless, stupid, a danger to his own family, lifted off him all at once. His wife cried too. And Isaiah Bell, who had carried his own version of that weight for 20 years, the quiet insistence of a powerful institution that the fault was in him and not in them, understood that this right here was why he had finally turned off the torch. Not the recall, not the vindication of his own long-buried career. This, one young man at a kitchen table getting to set down a shame that was never his to carry. "You go back to work with your head up," Isaiah told him. "You didn't do anything wrong. You never did. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise ever again. And if they try, you send them to me." There's a smaller scene too that I enjoy more than I probably should. The Continental regional rep, the smooth one who had come to the farm and blamed Marcus and lectured the Harmons about training their operators, came back once near the end before the recall was announced, still not understanding what he was walking into, still expecting to manage the dumb farmers. He started in on his usual routine in the farm office, and Walt Harmon let him talk for a while, and then Walt said, "You've met my equipment director, haven't you? Isaiah, why don't you tell the man about your background?" And Isaiah in his coveralls laid out his 11 years at Continental, his specialty and his failure analysis, and watched the rep's smooth face come apart in real time as he realized that the welder he had breezed past on his last visit was a former Continental structural engineer who had just written the report that was going to force a national recall. The rep left without finishing his coffee. It was, Isaiah admitted, one of the more satisfying afternoons of his life, and he did not feel that he had to apologize for enjoying it. Now let me tell you the 2 things that happened to the people in that office, because they are the heart of it. The first is Cody Harmon. And I want to be honest with you because it would be a cheap story if I told you Cody was destroyed and he wasn't, and the truth is better. Cody Harmon got humbled, which is a different and more useful thing than getting destroyed. He had spent his whole life believing the men who made his world run were beneath him and interchangeable. And he had stood in a doorway and laughed at a man who turned out to be one of the finest engineers the company that built his tractors had ever employed, and there is no coming back to your old opinion of yourself after a thing like that, not if you have any soul at all. And Cody, it turned out, had a little more soul than his behavior had suggested. He came to Isaiah a few weeks after the recall, and he did not make a big speech because he wasn't capable of one, but he said, "I owe you an apology, Mr. Bell, for a lot of things. I'm not going to insult you by pretending a few words fixes it, but I was wrong about you, and I was wrong about a lot of the men on this place, and I've been thinking that a man who is that wrong about that much probably ought to shut his mouth and start paying attention." It wasn't poetry, but it was real, and it was a beginning, and Isaiah, who knew something about second acts, accepted it as one. The second thing is Isaiah Bell himself, and it's the thing I most want you to carry out of here. Old Walt Harmon, who was 78 and slowing down, and had just watched his welder single-handedly expose a national defect and save his farm a fortune and possibly a life, made Isaiah an offer. Not a welder's job. He offered to make Isaiah the operations and equipment director of the entire Harmon operation, in charge of every machine on 2,000 acres, a real title, a real salary, the kind of role Isaiah's talent should have carried him to decades ago before a different company decided a black engineer could only rise so far. "I don't have an engineering department," Walt said. "I've got you. Same thing turns out. I'd be a fool to have a man like you welding brackets when he could be running the iron. Will you take it?" And Isaiah Bell, 52 years old, stood in that office where he had spoken his real name out loud for the first time in 20 years. And he had to sit down, because the thing he had stopped letting himself want the thing that had been taken from him, and that he had trained himself for 2 decades not to grieve, was being handed back to him by an old white farmer in the middle of nowhere who simply looked at the work and could not understand why anyone would waste it. He took the job. But he did one thing first, one condition, and it tells you who he was. He asked Walt to make Marcus Webb his second in command to train up, because the boy had a good head and a good heart, and had been badly wronged and deserved a future, and because Isaiah had spent his whole life wishing one single person with power had ever looked at him and decided to open a door instead of closing one. Walt agreed on the spot. And so the young man who had nearly died on the North Slope and had been told it was his own fault became the apprentice of the man who cleared his name, and the two of them ran the iron on that farm together for years. He was good at it, of course. Within 2 years, the Harmon operation ran better than it ever had because it was being run by an engineer instead of a man who thought equipment simply worked. Isaiah hired young mechanics and hands, and this is the part that matters. He taught them formally, the way no one had ever bothered to teach the men on that place, treating a farmhand who was good with his hands as a person who might have a mind worth developing, because Isaiah Bell had spent 20 years being a mind that everyone treated as only a pair of hands, and he was not going to run a shop that did that to anyone else. More than one of those kids went on to study engineering. Isaiah wrote their recommendation letters himself, signed with his degree, the degree he had once hidden in a drawer along with the truth. And he did one more thing quietly that I love. He kept the first broken bracket, the very first one that had cracked, the one that started it all. And he cleaned it up and mounted it on the wall of his new office, the fracture surface facing out. And when new hires asked about it, he told them the whole story, and he always ended it the same way, and I'll end with it too. For 2 years, Isaiah would say, "Everyone on this farm called me the welder, and they weren't wrong. I'm a welder and a good one, and there's no shame in it. The mistake they made wasn't calling me a welder. The mistake was deciding that because I was a welder, that was all I was, and there was nothing else worth asking about. People do that. They take one thing they can see about you and they decide it's the whole story, and then they stop being curious. And the moment they stop being curious, they stop being able to see you at all. Don't ever do that to a person. The quiet man welding your brackets might have designed the company that built them. The woman cleaning your office might be smarter than everyone she's cleaning up after. You do not know, and the only way to find out is to stay curious and keep your mouth from laughing long enough to actually look. That's all I've got. Now get back to work, and if you crack a weld, come find me, because there's a right way and a wrong way, and I'll show you the right way, same as somebody should have shown me a long time ago." So here's what I want to leave you with tonight. There is a Cody Harmon in every workplace in every town, a person who has decided, because it flatters them, that the quiet ones and the working ones and the ones who don't self-promote are beneath them and interchangeable and safe to laugh at. And there is an Isaiah Bell in every workplace in every town too. A person carrying a whole life inside them that no one has ever thought to ask about a degree in a drawer. A skill going to waste a proof sitting in a notebook. Because they've been taught that telling the truth costs too much. The tragedy is not just that the Codys mock the Isaiahs. The tragedy is that the Isaiahs have learned to hide because the world punished them the last time they didn't. And so their gifts sit in drawers and kids get put on machines with cracked brackets and everyone loses. Don't be the one laughing in the doorway. And if you're the one with the notebook in the drawer, hear me, the world that punished you for telling the truth was wrong. And staying quiet to survive is a thing I understand and will never judge. But there will come a day when your silence stops being about you and starts being about someone on the North Slope tomorrow. And on that day, I hope you turn off the torch and stand up. Because the thing they took from you was never actually yours to lose. It was who you are. And who you are can be hidden and can be wasted and can be laughed at, but it cannot be taken. And it is never, ever too late to pick it back up. If this story meant something to you, subscribe, because somebody out there tonight is being called just the welder, is hiding what they really are because the world made them afraid to show it. And they need to hear that being underestimated is not a verdict. It's just other people's failure of curiosity. Leave a comment and tell me, have you ever watched someone be badly, completely underestimated and then seen the truth come out? I read every single one and I never forget them. Until the next story, stay curious. Keep your mouth from laughing long enough to actually look, and never once decide that the single thing you can see about a person is the whole of who they are.